You are listening in the dark, and the dark is friendly, and the story continues. Breathe slowly. We are in the middle now, in the long middle years of a life that was nothing but middle, in the sense that even the great events that had already happened were preparation for what came next. Wu Zetian had been empress for several years when the full extent of what she was capable of in that role began to become apparent. Gaozong, her husband and emperor, the man whose love had made all of this possible, was not well. The headaches that had visited him intermittently since his youth had grown more severe and more frequent. There were days when the light was physically painful for him, when the open windows of the audience halls had to be covered, when he conducted business in near darkness, when his secretaries read documents to him rather than him reading them himself. The diagnosis has been debated by modern historians and physicians. Some suggest severe migraine, possibly complicated by hypertension. Some suggest a form of progressive eye disease. Some suggest the early stages of what we would now call a series of small strokes. The specific cause matters less than the effect, which was cumulative and undeniable. Gaozong was losing his ability to govern in the daily, practical sense. The documents continued to arrive, the decisions continued to require making, the empire continued to demand attention. Wu Zetian was there. She had always been there, in the political sense, watching, advising, influencing through the mechanisms of a trusted consort's access to power. Now she moved from influence to action. Documents came to her desk. She read them. She made decisions. She did not do this secretly or with any appearance of usurpation. She framed it always as assistance, as her duty as empress to support the emperor in his difficulty. The emperor, who loved her and trusted her and had always recognized her intelligence, allowed it. More than allowed it, encouraged it. The Tang court was eventually given formal recognition of the arrangement they were already living. Emperor Gaozong and Empress Wu Zetian, the two sages, ruling together from behind the ceremonial curtain that separated the inner court from the outer one. At formal audiences, the empress sat behind this curtain, unseen but present, listening, sometimes speaking through the emperor, sometimes speaking directly. The curtain was both a gesture toward convention and an acknowledgement of how completely convention had already been set aside. She used the power she was accumulating with a combination of genuine policy and ruthless political management that makes the historical record of this period difficult to narrate in a single coherent moral key. She did things that were genuinely good and things that were genuinely terrible, often in close proximity, and the challenge for any honest account is to hold both without letting one cancel the other. The examination system was her signature reform. The imperial civil service examination had existed in earlier dynasties and had been developed under the Tang, but Wu Zetian expanded and institutionalized it in ways that significantly changed who could rise to prominence in Chinese governance. She created new examination categories. She strengthened the principle that performance on the examinations, rather than birth into the right family, should determine advancement. She conducted examinations herself on multiple occasions, sitting in the examination hall, reading the essays of candidates, making selections personally. This was not merely enlightened governance, it was also brilliant politics. The old aristocratic families, the great clans of the North and West, who had dominated Chinese governance for centuries, derived their power partly from their control of government positions. If those positions were increasingly allocated by examination rather than birth, the old family's power was systematically eroded, and the new men who rose through the examinations owed their advancement not to their family name, but to Wu Zetian's system, which meant they owed it, in some meaningful sense, to her. She was building a new political class, a class loyal to the principle of meritocracy that she had created, and loyal, through that principle, to her. She also wrote. This was unusual enough to bear emphasis. She produced agricultural essays, practical manuals on farming techniques, irrigation, soil management, the cultivation of specific crops that were copied and distributed throughout the empire. She produced a text on governance. She commissioned historical and philosophical compilations. She was not content to govern quietly, in the background, in the way that a politically powerful woman of almost any era is advised to do. She wanted her ideas in circulation. She wanted to be visible as a thinker and a reformer, not merely as a figure in the background of the emperor's decisions. At the same time, the apparatus of fear was expanding. The secret police, a network of informants and investigators who reported directly to the empress rather than through the regular bureaucratic channels, were active throughout the court and increasingly beyond it. People were encouraged to denounce each other. Accusations of disloyalty, of conspiring against the emperor, of harboring sympathy for the deposed ministers or the Tang imperial family's branches that Wu Zetian distrusted, were investigated with a presumption of guilt. The men who served as her instruments in this work, Lai Yun-chen most notoriously, a judicial official of extraordinary ruthlessness who became synonymous with false accusation and torture, were people she chose and empowered and protected as long as they were useful. When they became liabilities, when public opinion against them was so overwhelming that their presence was damaging her standing, she dealt with them with the same dispatch she brought to every other obstacle. Lai Yun-chen was eventually executed. There were waves of purges that moved through the court and through the broader aristocracy. Members of the Tang imperial family, princes and their supporters, who were seen as potential centers of resistance, were brought before tribunals and found guilty of imagined conspiracies and exiled or executed. The numbers are disputed, as they are almost always in this kind of historical account, but the pattern is consistent. Anyone who represented a plausible alternative to Wu Zetian's authority was at risk. Was the fear warranted? Were there actual conspiracies? Yes, some of them were real. The court was full of people who genuinely resented and opposed Wu Zetian, who would have acted against her if they could find safe ground on which to stand. The problem is that a system of informants and judicial torture cannot distinguish between real conspiracies and imagined ones. It is designed to produce confessions, and it produces confessions whether the accused are guilty or innocent, which means it inevitably consumes both. The empire continued to function through all of this. The harvests were brought in, the frontiers were maintained, the examination system kept producing capable officials who kept the administrative machinery running. What a later age might call the administrative state of the Tang Dynasty was robust enough to absorb the political violence at its center and continued to function around it. This is, in its way, a testament both to Wu Zetian's competence and to the resilience of the institutions she was simultaneously strengthening and abusing. Emperor Gaozong died in 683 AD in the holy capital of Luoyang, which Wu Zetian had made the effective center of imperial operations. He was 55 years old. He had been, in many ways, the person who made everything possible for her, the man whose love had rescued her from the convent, whose weakness had created the space for her power, whose trust she had honored in her way and exceeded in hers. She had genuine feelings for him. History's cynical reading of their relationship, in which he was simply a pawn she used and discarded, does not account for the evidence of decades of consistent mutual support, of a partnership that was unequal and complicated and real. When he died, she was 57 or 58 years old. The children she had borne him were grown. The empire was hers to manage, as it had been in practical terms for years, and the question that had always been deferred was now directly in front of her. What came next? The answer was not obvious. It wasn't even legal by any framework that existed, but Wu Zetian had spent decades operating between what was legal and what was possible. and what was possible, she had always believed, was larger than what the rules said. There is a kind of love that is real and complete, and also does not soften, that holds the beloved clearly, sees them accurately, and still chooses the harder path when the harder path is necessary. Wu Zetian loved her children. This is not a complicated claim. The evidence for her emotional engagement with her children is present in the historical record in small, durable ways. But she also used them, she arranged them, she moved them across the board of Tang politics with a precision that left marks no amount of later softening of the historical record can entirely erase. After Gaozong died, Wu Zetian became Empress Dowager and regent for her son, Li Zhe, who took the throne as Emperor Zhongzong. He was a man of reasonable intelligence and limited will, someone who might have made a competent.
The speed and decisiveness of this action sent a message through the court that everyone received clearly. The Empress Dowager was not a ceremonial figure. She was not a mother to be managed or maneuvered around. She was the power, and the emperor existed at her pleasure, and everyone, including her sons, needed to understand this. She replaced Zhongzong with his brother Li Dan, who became Emperor Ruzong. Ruzong was, by every account, a man who understood his situation with great clarity and adapted to it with great wisdom, where wisdom means the ability to survive by accepting the role you have been assigned. He conducted himself as emperor in name, while his mother governed in fact. He did not attempt to make appointments she had not approved. He did not make speeches about his own authority. He was quiet, cultured, and alive, which is more than could be said for the alternatives. The court adjusted. Courts always adjust because the people who make up a court are, above all, survivors, and survival requires the ability to understand which way the wind is blowing. The wind was blowing toward Wu Zetian. It had been blowing that way for years. Those who bent in that direction survived. Those who stood rigid for principle or pride or genuine courage were broken. There were attempted coups, several of them over the years of Wu Zetian's regency and then her direct rule. Men of the Tang imperial family, princes who felt the rightness of restoration burning in them, organized. They gathered supporters. They made plans. All of them failed. And their failure was not accidental. It was the result of the surveillance network Wu Zetian had built, which reached into every corner of the court and the aristocracy and reported back to her before plans became actions. Each failed coup gave her both justification and material. Justification for another purge, another round of investigations, another wave of executions of people who had been, or might have been, or were accused of having been, involved in plotting against her. Material in the sense that the investigations always expanded to consume people who had been entirely innocent of the specific accusation, but who were inconvenient for other reasons. Her son, Li Xian, Crown Prince Zhang Huai, her third son, was a man of real intellectual gifts. He wrote commentary on historical texts with a sharpness and a candor that some of her mother's advisors read, perhaps correctly, as implicit criticism of her methods. Whether he intended this reading or not, whether he was actually engaging in political dissent or simply doing the scholar's honest work of engaging seriously with historical material, the result was the same. He was accused, stripped of his title, exiled to a remote region. He died in exile a few years later, almost certainly by suicide under pressure from her mother's agents. He was her son. He was perhaps the most intellectually gifted of her children, and she exiled him to his death. These are the facts that no amount of context entirely smooths over. She had the capacity to do this. She exercised it. The architecture of the modern mind insists on asking, what kind of person does this? But the architecture of her world asked a different question, or no question at all, because the category of person that applied to her was simply a different thing from anything we can easily identify with.
She was a woman who had spent her entire life in a context where the personal and the political were not merely intertwined, but identical. Her children were political assets from the day of their birth. Her love for them, and she did love them, in whatever form her love took, coexisted with her understanding of what they were in the game she was playing. When they served the game, she elevated them. When they threatened it, she removed them. This is not a comfortable truth, but it is the truth. And beneath all of it, something was building. Something she had been working toward for years, possibly decades. Something so unprecedented that even she, who had spent her life doing unprecedented things, must have understood that this step was different. This step was permanent. This step would make her not merely the most powerful woman in China, but a category of one, a phenomenon that the language of her civilization had no ready name for. She was going to declare herself emperor. Not empress, not regent, emperor, the sovereign, the son of heaven, except that she was not a son, and she would find a way to address that particular complication, too. Let yourself settle deeper into the quiet. We have traveled a long way tonight, through the silk corridors of the inner palace and the pine-scented silence of the convent and the political violence of the court. And now we are arriving at the center of it all, the moment that everything before had been building toward. The year was 690 A.D. Wu Zetian was 65 years old, or perhaps 66. The precise counting of her years is subject to the usual uncertainties of historical record, where dates drift and ages are sometimes calculated by different systems. Old by the standards of her era, ancient by the standards of most imperial courts, where the powerful rarely survived to their 60s. A woman who had been a concubine and a nun and an empress and a regent and was about to do something that no one in the history of the world's most ancient continuous civilization had ever done. She had prepared the ground with extraordinary thoroughness over years that were themselves a kind of campaign. The preparations moved on multiple fronts simultaneously, with the coordination of a strategist who understood that the legitimacy of an unprecedented act must be built from multiple directions at once. The Buddhist campaign was the most visible. Wu Zetian had been deepening her Buddhist identity publicly for years, presenting herself not merely as a devout practitioner, but someone with a specific sacred significance in the history of the faith. She commissioned the creation and wide distribution of a text called the Da Yun Jing, the Great Cloud Sutra, which had been reinterpreted with her oversight and probably her direct input to contain a prophecy of a female world ruler who would bring a new age of Buddhist flourishing to the world. Monks throughout the empire were given copies. They were expected to preach this interpretation from their pulpits. She also cultivated the specific identity of Maitreya, the future Buddha, the compassionate one who would appear in the world to usher in a new era. In Buddhist cosmology, Maitreya is not gendered in the way that ordinary human beings are gendered. Maitreya is a bodhisattva, a being of enlightenment, and the rules of ordinary gender do not apply to enlightened beings. This gave Wu Zetian a conceptual framework wherein a female ruler was not merely acceptable, but cosmically appropriate. At the same time, she was using more earthly forms of legitimation. Petitions began to arrive at court, from officials, from Buddhist communities, from various groups throughout the empire, requesting that the Empress Dowager formally assume the title of emperor. The petitions were almost certainly organized. They had the feel of a coordinated campaign rather than a spontaneous popular movement. But they were real documents, signed by real people, and they gave the form of public demand to what was, at its core, a decision Wu Zetian had already made. She accepted the petitions with apparent reluctance. This was part of the performance. A ruler who is too eager to seize power seems merely ambitious. A ruler who must be persuaded, who accepts the throne only because the weight of demand makes refusal impossible, seems to be responding to history, rather than making it. Wu Zetian knew enough of history to know this distinction and to perform it correctly. In 690 AD, Wu Zetian declared the establishment of the Zhou dynasty, named for the great ancient Zhou dynasty that had ruled China for nearly 8 centuries before the Qin unification. She took the title Sheng Shen Huangdi, Holy Divine Emperor. She moved the imperial capital formally to Luoyang, which she renamed the Holy Capital. She wore the yellow robes that were the imperial color. She received the bows of every minister and official in the empire. She sat on the dragon throne. She was the Emperor of China, the only woman in Chinese history to hold this title in her own right, not as consort or regent, but as sovereign. The Zhou dynasty lasted 15 years, from 690 to 705. 15 years is not a long time in the scale of Chinese dynastic history, where some dynasties lasted for centuries, but it is long enough to govern, to build, to change things, to leave marks that persist. The most visible marks were physical. The Longmen grottos, cut into the limestone cliffs along the Yi River south of Luoyang, reached their peak of artistic development during Wu Zetian's reign. The cliff faces are covered with Buddhist carvings, over 100,000 individual figures, ranging from tiny votive images a few inches high to massive Buddhas carved at a scale that defies the imagination. The central figure, the great Vairochana Buddha of the Fengshen Temple, stands over 17 meters high and gazes across the valley with an expression of extraordinary serenity. This figure's face has been studied carefully by art historians, and many of them believe, though it cannot be definitively proven, that the face was modeled on Wu Zetian herself. The features are feminine, composed, the eyes half lowered in the expression that Buddhist icons.
The night is deep now. We are in the long hours, the ones that belong to the very old and the very young, the hours when the world is quiet enough that you can hear your own breathing. Settle here. Let the story carry you. Wu Zetian, in her final years, was a woman navigating the distance between the self she had been and the self that remained. She was 80 years old, or close to it. The exact counting is uncertain, the years at the end of a life always more uncertain than the years at the beginning. She had been governing China, in one form or another, for more than 40 years. She had been alive for more years than most people of her era could imagine being alive, and her body, which had carried all of this for so long, was finally, slowly beginning to stop. She spent more time in her private chambers. The formal audiences that had been the rhythm of her governance for decades were less frequent and shorter. The Zhang brothers, the 2 beautiful young men who had been her companions and her shields against the court's judgment, had become, in that dangerous way that people with privileged access always become, a second layer of power. They controlled who saw the Empress. They filtered what she heard. They had their own interests, their own enemies, their own network of favors and resentments. The men who had built their careers under Wu Zetian's system, capable administrators who had risen through examinations, officials who understood governance because she had created the institutions that taught it, were watching the Zhang brothers with a frustration that had been building for years. They had accepted Wu Zetian's rule because she was competent, and because competence was, in the end, the only justification for any exercise of power that stood up to scrutiny. They could not accept the Zhang brothers. The Zhang brothers were not competent. They were decorative. They were, in the most dangerous political sense, irrelevant to the actual business of governing an empire. And yet, they stood between the Empress and the men who were trying to conduct that business. There was also the question of what happened after. Wu Zetian had named her son, Li Jie, the former Emperor Zhongzong, whom she had deposed decades ago, as crown prince. This was a recognition that the Zhou dynasty would not outlast her. It was a concession to reality, made with the characteristic lack of sentimentality that defined her relationship to facts she could not change. The Zhou was hers. It would end with her. Li Jie was Tang, and China would be Tang again. The acknowledgement of this did not mean she accepted it peacefully. By the accounts we have, she struggled with it for years before making the decision, struggled with the question of whether there was any path to a Zhou succession that was viable, any member of the Wu family who could hold the throne after her. She consulted widely, she deliberated, and ultimately she accepted what the court and the military and the examination system's loyal graduates had been quietly and consistently telling her, that the Zhou was not transferable, that her authority was personal and could not be inherited by anyone who was not Tang. Zhongzong was named crown prince. He was alive. He was waiting, in the patient way of someone who has learned patience the hard way, for the natural end of a situation that could not otherwise be resolved. The men who moved against Wu Zetian in 705 were not, by any standard, revolutionary firebrands. Zhang Zhangji, the senior minister who led the coup, was a veteran official of her own court, a man who had served her faithfully for decades and who moved against her now, not because he had always opposed her, but because he had concluded that the situation had reached a point where continuation was more dangerous than change. The coup was called the Shenlong, after the Reign-era name of that year. It moved in the night. The mechanics were efficient in the way that coups by experienced men usually are. They knew the palace, they knew the schedules, they had the support of enough military commanders to ensure that any resistance would be isolated and ineffective. They went first to the Zhang brothers' quarters. Both men were killed before the night was over, cut down in the palace they had occupied as though it were their personal territory, removed from the story with the speed of men who had been making themselves necessary for too long, and finally exhausted everyone's patience. Then the conspirators went to the Empress. She was in her bedchamber, 80 years old, unwell, the world coming apart around her in the darkness. The men who had come to her were not strangers. They were people she had worked with, had relied on, had in some cases elevated from obscurity. They stood in her chamber and told her what had happened. They told her the Zhang brothers were dead. They presented her with the reality that was now hers to inhabit. The Zhou was over. She asked to see her son. She was shown Li Jie, and she said to him, in the tone of a woman who refuses to perform collapse, no matter what she is feeling, "So it was you who had them killed. Now that the culprits have been eliminated, you should return to the Eastern Palace." It is a remarkable thing to say. She was trying, in that sentence, to frame the night's events in a way that preserved a certain coherence. She was implying that the Zhang brothers were the problem, that their removal was a reasonable act, that the orderly succession she had already arranged could now proceed smoothly. She was refusing to call it what it was. She was refusing to call herself its victim. Whether this was dignity or denial or something more complex than either, it was characteristically her. Right up to the end, she was managing the narrative. Zhongzong was restored to the throne. Wu Zetian was given the title of Empress Regnant Emerita, a title that acknowledged her historical reality without giving her any present power. She was moved to a palace outside the capital, the Songyang Palace, where she spent the last 9 months of her life. She was not imprisoned exactly. She had a palace, she had attendants, she had the form of honor, but she had no power, and she was not going back to where the power was, and she knew it. The shape of her final months is difficult to reconstruct. What did she do in those days? What did she think about? What did she say to the women who attended her in the long afternoon hours when the garden outside the window was quiet and the capital was a distant sound? She died in December of 705. The official date is the 16th day of the 11th month of the first year of the Shenlong era. She was given a posthumous name, Zetian Daseng Honggu, the great sage empress who emulates heaven. The name Zetian, which she had given herself, stuck, a choice she had made for herself that outlasts all the choices others tried to make for her.
She was buried in the Qianling Mausoleum in the Liangshan Mountain beside Gaozong, and before she died, she gave instructions about the stone. We are near the end of the night. The story is slowing now, as stories should at this hour, finding the long and gentle pace of things that are winding toward rest. Let yourself move with it. Let your breath slow. Let the words come in like water, easy and quiet. The Qianling Mausoleum is in Shanxi Province, in the mountains northwest of the modern city of Xi'an. If you were to visit it today, and you can, it is a protected site, a place where people still go to stand in the presence of something very old. You would arrive at the base of a mountain that looks from a distance like a natural feature of the landscape. Two rounded peaks, side by side, draped with whatever the season brings. Green grass in summer, golden in autumn, bare and dark in winter. The mountain is the tomb. The two peaks are the two mounds above the burial chambers. Inside the mountain, cut deep into the living rock, are chambers where emperors and the things that belonged to emperors were laid to rest. Silk and jade and gold and lacquered wood and everything that the Tang Dynasty's craftsmen could make beautiful enough to be worth burying. Gaozong was buried there first, in 684, 2 years after Wu Zetian chose Liangshan as the site. When she died 21 years later, she was placed beside him, the man whose love had made everything possible, and the woman whose ambition had made everything actual, side by side in the dark mountain forever. The approach to the mausoleum is lined with the sacred road, a ceremonial road bordered by stone sculptures that stand in two long files facing each other across the path. Horses, carved in the fluid, energetic style of Tang sculpture, their muscles visible beneath the stone, their legs caught in mid-movement. Lions, powerful and stylized, their features worn smooth by centuries of wind, but their presence still formidable. Ostriches, brought to China along the Silk Road and carved here as symbols of the empire's vast reach. Officials, their robes falling in regular stone folds, their faces eroded to near blankness by time. At the end of this road, near the mausoleum itself, stand two stone stelae, pillars of stone, each one enormous, each one set in a great stone base in the shape of a turtle, the animal that in Chinese symbolism represents longevity and the endurance of great things. One of them carries an inscription about Emperor
Agricultural reforms were still in place. The Longmen grottos were still in the cliff. The blank stone was still blank. As centuries passed, the conversations about her multiplied. Song Dynasty scholars debated her governance with the seriousness they brought to all great historical questions. Ming and Qing poets wrote about her with a mixture of admiration and condemnation that often existed in the same poem, the same stanza, the same breath. She appeared in plays, in novels, in the popular stories that move through a culture the way water moves through ground, finding every crack and filling it. In the 20th century, she was briefly rehabilitated by the People's Republic as a feminist ancestor, a woman who had challenged feudal patriarchy and demonstrated that women were not inherently less capable of governance than men. This interpretation was enthusiastic and not without basis, but it was also incomplete. Wu Zetian had not been fighting for women's rights as a category. She had been fighting for her own power as an individual. She had not elevated other women systematically. She had used women and discarded them as readily as she had used and discarded men. She was not a feminist hero in any straightforward sense. She was something more specific and more difficult. A person who happened to be a woman and who refused to let that fact constrain what she reached for, at whatever cost, and who succeeded. The blank stone is still there, and the night is still around us, and there is one more chapter to tell before we reach the end. We have traveled a very long way tonight. From a courtyard in Wenshui where a girl learned to read by the light of an oil lamp, the characters forming slowly under her brush in the cool early morning. Through the gates of a palace that was the largest and most brilliant city in the world. Through the silence of a Buddhist convent in pine-covered hills. Through decades of court politics and maternal calculation and governance and fear and beauty and cruelty and patience and the long, slow accumulation of a power so unprecedented that the language of her civilization barely had words for it. Through 15 years on the dragon throne. Through a winter night when old men moved through the palace and cut down 2 beautiful young men and came to an 80-year-old woman's bedchamber with the news that everything was over. Through 9 months in a palace outside the capital, watching the world continue without her. To a mountain in Shanxi where a blank stone stands in the wind, holding 13 centuries of unanswered questions. This is where we are now, at the end of the story and at the beginning of the long echo. Wu Zetian was buried in December of 705 AD. The mountain sealed itself over her, and she entered the long sleep that every person who has ever lived enters eventually. The world continued. The Tang Dynasty continued. Her sons navigated the complicated inheritance of the dynasty she had temporarily replaced, some of them more successfully than others. Zhongzhan was restored, but proved a weak emperor, eventually poisoned by his wife and her faction in 710. Rizong, the compliant one, took the throne briefly and then abdicated in favor of his own son, the remarkable Emperor Xuanzong, whose reign would become one of the great cultural flourishings of the Tang Dynasty. A golden age of poetry particularly, when the greatest poets in Chinese history were alive at the same time and knew each other and wrote to each other and about each other. Du Fu, Li Bai, Wang Wei, names that echo through the centuries. The dynasty that Wu Zetian had temporarily displaced came back and bloomed. And yet, the examination system that Wu Zetian had pushed forward, the merit-based selection of officials that she had strengthened and expanded and made central to the administrative identity of the empire, continued to function, continued to develop, continued to evolve through the Tang and Song dynasties and the Yuan and the Ming and the Qing, generation after generation, producing the officials who managed the machinery of civilization. The system finally ended in 1905 when the last Qing emperor abolished it under pressure of modernization. By that time, it had been functioning for approximately 13 centuries, shaped at a crucial early moment by a woman who understood that loyalty to talent was more durable than loyalty to blood. The Longmen Grottos still stand. You can go there today. You can board a train from Xi'an or Zhengzhou and travel to Luoyang and then take a bus or taxi along the Yi River to the cliffside where 13 centuries of weather and human attention have left their marks on the carvings that Wu Zetian's patronage and her personal donation helped to complete. The great Vairocana Buddha is still there, gazing across the valley with the serene composure of someone who has been looking at the world long enough to have stopped being surprised by it. Around the central figure, hundreds of attendant figures in various states of preservation, some sharp and clear, some worn to near abstraction by time and rain, all of them part of the extraordinary vision that Wu Zetian commissioned at the height of her power. As you rest here tonight, let yourself imagine standing at the foot of that great carved figure, the Yi River moving behind you, dark and quiet, the cliff face rising in front of you, the figures emerging from the stone, as though the stone is slowly releasing them, as though they were always there and the carvers were simply finding them.
The light is the particular gold of late afternoon in a river valley, the kind of light that makes old things look like themselves rather than like ruins. You are thinking about the blank stone, about what it means to leave the words unwritten, about the difference between wanting to be remembered and wanting to be understood, and whether those are ever really the same thing. About a woman who spent her entire life using words, reading them, writing them, deploying them with precision, commissioning them from others, weaponizing them and poetizing them, and building political arguments with them, and who chose at the very last to leave the most important surface in her life unmarked. She executed the father of her son. Let us be precise about this. Xiao Shufi, Consort Xiao, who was Zhongzong's mother as much as Wu Zetian was, who had been the rival and the enemy, and the woman whose hands and feet were cut off and died in a vat of wine, was in some sense the mother of Wu Zetian's son as well, insofar as the inner palace's complicated web of maternal and filial relationships operated. The men who were fathers of her children's rivals, the men who were brothers or supporters of the people she needed to remove, she moved against them with a thoroughness that left no room for sentiment. She thought she was going home. This is the promise the title made, and this is what it means. In those final months, reduced to an empress emerita in a palace outside the capital, she still believed, the evidence suggests she still believed, that the arc of history was not done with her, that the conversation she had started was not over, that the blank stone was not a failure, but an invitation, and the invitation would be accepted. That she was going home to legacy, to memory, to the kind of presence in the world that does not require a body to maintain. Was she right? In the most important sense, yes. She has never stopped being talked about. She has been talked about every century since her death, in every dynasty, in languages that did not exist when she was alive, by people in cultures that were still thousands of years from forming when she sat on the dragon throne. Tonight, you are talking about her, or rather, you are listening to her story, which is the same thing in the language of the dead. The blank stone has been filled in the only way it was ever going to be filled, not with a single official inscription, but with the accumulated weight of 13 centuries of human attention. Every poem written about her, every historical account, every play and novel and scholarly essay and conversation at a kitchen table and story told to a child at bedtime, all of it is the inscription. All of it is what goes on the stone. Was she a monster? Was she a hero? Was she a mother, a lover, a tyrant, a visionary, a survivor, a builder, a destroyer? The answer is that she was all of these things and none of them completely, and that the framework of simple moral categories was not designed to contain what she was. She was specific. She was irreducible. She was a person who happened to be a woman and who refused to let that fact constrain what she reached for, at whatever cost, and who succeeded. The blank stone is still there, and the night is still around us, and there is one more chapter to tell before we reach the end. We have traveled a very long way tonight, from a courtyard in Wen Shui where a girl learned to read by the light of an oil lamp, the